Thanks for coming this morning. Apparently, this little teaser that I've had out there has interested several of you on many levels to hear about this case. So my topic, Professor Dudley's insanity case, is going to take a look at a case that played out right here in Pipestone County, beginning in late 1902 and then into the 1903 newspapers within the county. On the surface, when I first stumbled upon this, it involves the insanity case of somebody known as Professor Dudley of Woodstock, Minnesota. But as the story plays out and unfolds, it really becomes a bigger look at society at the time. It's the story of a marriage that was failing. It's the story of a male-dominated patriarchal society and how the case was handled during that era. So I was working on research for our Small Town Series booklet that will be released next Friday on murder and mayhem when I stumbled upon this story. This story is not featured in the book. There are other stories about insanity. This was a different one that I really wanted to take more time and dig into, and that's why it's not in the book. It starts on November 28th of 1902. The insanity case of Professor Dudley of Woodstock first appeared in the Pipestone County Star. The brief paragraph mentioned that Professor Dudley was the principal at the Woodstock school, and the party who had made the accusation against him that he was insane was his wife. Several witnesses were to be questioned during the case while he was being examined. He had a defense attorney, and the attorney publicly stated that this was not really a case of insanity. This was a case of a domestic quarrel. If it's a domestic quarrel, how can it be in a probate court being judged for insanity? That's kind of where my thought process was going. The local newspaper's report was not unbiased. Today, when we read the newspapers, the editors and reporters are trying very hard to present just the facts, right, and keep their opinions out. Early newspapers did not do such a great job of that. Though the case was still taking place in the courts, when that edition of the newspaper went to press, the editor of the paper boldly stated, "It is not generally believed that the insanity charge will be sustained. The people of Woodstock are agitated over the case of Professor Dudley. He has taught school in Edgerton and other points in the county for years and is a man of high esteem." Unbiased? I think not. The newspaper is already in their minds, even though the case hasn't even made it all the way through the court system, kind of saying, he's not insane. The next week, on December 5th, 1902, page 1, the Pipestone County Star reported the headline, "Declared Not Insane." The brief article again stated that the charge had been made by his wife against him as the result of a domestic dispute. Following the determination that Mr. Dudley was sane, Mrs. Dudley reportedly left the marriage to go live in Chandler. On page 7 of the same issue, the case was reported with more details that seemed to include evidence to substantiate the claim that this was a case of domestic issues within their family home. Professor Dudley's defense about his sanity was really that he was trying merely to send their son to Rochester to be examined, and his wife had disagreed. He went on to state that their home was filthy, his wife was a poor housekeeper, and one morning he had seen his daughter in the family kitchen trying to change out of her night clothes in front of the cook stove, and in the filth he had asked her to leave and go find another place to do it. His wife had become quite angry when he had done that, and she attacked him with the organ stool. That was his defense. He physically overpowered her and took away the organ bench, and in doing so, she had scratched him in the face, and he had a scratch on his face for about 2 weeks, and he had witnesses that would testify they had seen the scratches on his face, and because of that, he further went on to state that, yes, they had marital problems. In his defense, he had offered her a divorce. He was willing to give her half of their personal belongings. And he asserted that her reason for pursuing the insanity charge was that she wanted him sent away so that she could have 100% of their property and custody of the children. Because in the turn of the century, in a divorce case, the children did not automatically go to the mother. Almost always they went to the father, who had the financial means to support them. Women didn't hold jobs and didn't have the means to support the children. The story continued to unfold in the Pipestone County Star on December 12th, when a public notice from Mr. Dudley was printed. It read, "Notice is hereby given that whereas Lizzie A. Dudley, my present wife, has left my bed and board with the apparent determination to damage me socially and financially, I, Lucius A. Dudley, her husband, forbid that any person whatsoever shall harbor her on my account or give herald or credit in any way with the expectation of receiving pay from me or my assigns or administrators in any manner. Signed, Lucius A. Dudley, dated Woodstock, Minnesota, December 3rd, 1902. So he is basically public notified that if you take her in, don't send me the bill for her maintenance. I'm not paying her room, her board, any of that. Now at this point, does this seem like an insanity case to anybody in the room? It certainly did not to me. It seemed more like something that belonged in a divorce court than a probate court related to charges of insanity. So I was unclear what it took to be deemed to be insane. So I took a look at the Minnesota statutes related to insanity at the time. Now, in late 1902, when this case came to the courts and was making the local newspaper, the Minnesota statutes from 1894 were the ones that were relevant to insanity. They had been established in 1894 and there had been no changes made by 1902. So these were the laws on the book on how to determine if somebody should be determined to be insane. Chapter 45A, Section 14, gave that jurisdiction to the probate judge of any county to determine someone's sanity. And any civilian could make a claim against another. And if it was filed in probate court, the probate judge was legally obligated to examine the accused person. It was his responsibility, and as law, he could make them be examined against their will if need be. They could be brought in. They could be arrested, handcuffed, whatever it took to bring them before the probate court. He would then seat a jury to conduct the examination. Now, the jury was a simple 3-person panel. They had to be sworn in and they had to promise to be impartial. One person of that jury was the probate judge himself. A second one had to be a medical doctor. And the third person was simply defined as a reputable person. Often when I found stories of insanity cases, they were using 2 doctors in Pipestone County. I don't know what the other definition of a reputable person might be. I suppose that would be a determination of the probate judge and who he felt was reputable. Witnesses for both sides could be called, they could be questioned, they could be forced to testify, if necessary, against a loved one. When the examination was complete, the jury would file their findings in writing with the probate judge. If the accused person was found to be insane, the judge would order them to be committed to the superintendent of one of the state hospitals for the insane. The sheriff was tasked with taking them and delivering them to that location. If the person found to be insane was a female attendant was required to go with the sheriff. Often the female attendant was the sheriff's wife. If that female was married, her husband could go in lieu of a female attendant. It seemed like on the surface that these laws were pretty straightforward. I personally was a bit concerned that you could be forced to testify against your wife or your husband or your child because anybody could be forced to mention, but they seem pretty straightforward in the laws. On the case of insanity that originated in Pipestone County that I have found, the individuals from Pipestone County were being sent to St. Peter. This is an image from 1974 of the St. Peter Insane Asylum. That is what it was called. It was the first hospital of its kind in Minnesota, and it was established by Minnesota state legislation in 1866. That's likely where Professor Dudley would have been sent. I'm going to revisit this a little more in just a few minutes. Now, looking a bit more deeply into those insanity laws, Code 4686 had 27 specific questions that the person accused of being insane were asked. Some were basic. What's your name? How old are you? Where do you live? What's your occupation? If you're sane, you should be able to answer those questions pretty easily, right? And if you can't answer them, it might tip the hat towards, oh, they don't even know what their name is. However, as the questions go a little deeper, the topic really seems to become more about the societal norms of the day, rather than a true basis on sanity. Question 7, for instance, asked if the person was the member of a church. Now, I'm not here to argue or discuss whether you should or should not be a member of a church, but does that really have the basis of determining if somebody is sane or not? At 1900, it seems that it did make a basis. It also, question 8, asked questions in regards to habits of drinking and other moral issues. Again, that seems a bit subjective. Did it mean that if you drank alcohol, you could be considered insane? The questions went on to ask more things related to your family medical history and your personal history with mental health issues. In question 21, an individual's hygiene habits were questioned. How often do you bathe? What are your living conditions? And Professor Dudley, in his defense, had used his wife's hygiene habits in developing his case for why he was sane. Question 22 and beyond seemed to ask general health, history of diseases like epilepsy, or even if you had chronic open sores. I don't know what that's about, but today somebody with chronic open sores or sores that won't heal might be somebody that would be considered diabetic in 1900 when we didn't have the same medical care that we have today. I wondered if this truly played a role in determining if somebody was truly sane or not. And it turns out, yes, it did actually play a role. Alcoholics who suffered from epileptics and those who suffered from epileptic seizures could be committed to the insane hospitals in Minnesota because they were seen as a danger to themselves or a danger to others. According to the Communicating Psychological Science that did a study on the St. Peter Insane Asylum, the causes for people being committed for insanity between 1864 and 1894 included ill health, overwork, domestic trouble, which is where we're at with the Professor Dudley case, epilepsy, religious excitement, political excitement, and more. In the late 1800s, there was generally a lack of understanding as to what caused insanity, and an understanding was missed on what to do to treat mental health issues. We're much better at that in the world today. Two of the more bizarre reasons, highlighted pink that you're looking at in the screen, that were reasons for admission to St. Peter during that 30-year window that they looked at, was prolonged lactation and consulting a fortune teller. With no real knowledge of how to treat mental illness, the focus of places like St. Peter was to control the behavior. If someone was deemed to be a risk to themselves or to others, they could be sent to one of these institutions on an insanity charge. So even people that suffered from epilepsy, that had tremors and all of the things, might be considered to be a hazard to themselves and be sent there for treatment. But they weren't really being treated for the root cause, only to keep them out of society and out of harm's way, so to speak. In knowing some of the reasons why someone could be sent to St. Peter, we start to see some of the implications of this Mr. Dudley or Professor Dudley's case, right? And how something that looks like a marital spat ends up in front of the courts. Mrs. Dudley's case against Professor Dudley was not out of ordinary at the time. Domestic troubles was a reason somebody could be sent. The question of hygiene that he had used as his defense, he claimed he liked a neat and orderly home. All of that would have worked in his favor to be found sane. Still, Mrs. Dudley was stepping outside of society norms. Certainly in 1902 and 1903, it was a male-controlled world. Women, when they married, were considered their husband's property. They could not enter into contract. They could not do anything without their husband's permission. Getting her husband to be judged insane would have been somewhat of an uphill battle for Mrs. Dudley or any other woman in the 1900 patriarchal society. Wives were property, not people. Mrs. Dudley had to overcome some gender biases, and she did not do so. The court ruled in his favor that he was sane. All of this information is helpful as the Dudley case continues to unfold. On January 2nd, 1903, the Pipestone County Star reported that Professor Dudley had resigned his position at Woodstock School. He was going to pursue a career on the stage, in theater, and he was going to present a play that he had written, a love letter in rhyme with multiple acts and a conclusion, on the stage of the Woodstock Opera Hall. It would have a prelude, a complaint, a confession, and a conclusion. The title, The Life of a Loony, by one of them. Perhaps that was a tongue-in-cheek play, a recreation of his personal life that he's going to play out on the stage and in the pages of the newspaper? Yeah. Perhaps not. On January 29th, 1903, the Edgerton Enterprise and the Farmer's Leader both reported Professor Dudley committed. The article revealed that Mr. Dudley had again been brought before the examining board of the Pipestone County probate court by his wife, his estranged wife at this time. And this time, Drs. McGillivray and Dr. Jenkins determined that he was mentally unbalanced. The reports indicated that it was his inability to get along with his wife and with the other women of the Woodstock community, coupled with his own admission that he had been drinking hard of late, led to his being sent to St. Peter. When he was informed of the decision to send him to that location, he reportedly stated that he would willingly go to hell to get away from that woman. He was referring to his wife. The article from the Farmer's Leader stated that Dudley's inability to get along with women in the community had led to his removal from firing, not his resignation from his job as principal at the Woodstock School. His theatrical performance had showed considerable evidence of him being mentally unbalanced. It also reported that Professor Dudley had actually been judged insane once before and had spent time at an institution in Yankton, South Dakota from 1877 to 1888. Information that did not come out during his first hearing. Dudley sent Dr. McGillivray a letter about 2 months after he was taken to St. Peter. Remember, that was the usual place, and I showed that image earlier. So I had said after his first case, that's probably where he would be sent. After the second case, that is where he was sent. In the letter, he remarked that he had gained 10 pounds since arriving because he had finally been provided with the proper nutrition that his wife had failed to give him, that he had a much better mental balance because of the neatness and the cleanliness that he was living in, and it made him feel so much better. He was sure that he was ready to return home, and he asked Dr. McGillivray to recommend that he be released from St. Peter. For his part, Dr. McGillivray reported that he would take no action on the matter. I wonder if that was a case of fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. I'm washing my hands of this. That is for the superintendent of the institution to make that determination. Now, no more was ever learned about Professor Dudley. It is unknown how long he spent at St. Peter. But the final information that I did locate was not on Professor Dudley, but rather on his wife, Mrs. Dudley. In the August 21st, 1903 edition of the Pipestone County Star, it was reported that she and her son Roland were moving to Chicago. Now, I would kind of wrap up today's presentation by stating that I am not sharing this in any way, shape, or form to make light of mental health issues. We absolutely know that mental health issues are real, that there are people who suffer, and that we've come a long way in the United States in recognizing what is and is not a mental health issue and how to treat mental health issues. I presented this case because in my mind, it's not as much about whether he was or was not insane. To me, it's a case of how did he get by the first time and then 2 weeks later be found to be insane. And when I look at that, I really think that takes us back to society, norms, and acceptance at the time. The first time, he had a scapegoat. His wife was the scapegoat. It's her fault that I have these erratic behaviors because she's a poor housekeeper. It never came uncovered that he had suffered in the past and had spent time in Yankton. Everybody took what he said at face value, the examining board, the jury, and believed it because that was society. He had this reputation he had established. But later, when she left the home, his behaviors then became something that people questioned. And without that scapegoat in the home anymore, when he was brought before the board the second time, things didn't add up. And then they determined, okay, these behaviors are the behaviors of somebody that has some mental health issues. Perhaps his Life of a Loony by one of them was not tongue-in-cheek look at his life, but rather an admission on his part. Maybe a stab at his estranged life and the marital problems that they were experiencing. We can't know for certain, but certainly the case brings 1900 society norms into questions as they related to determining one's mental health. And so with that, I would entertain questions or comments on the case, including the laws and things we looked at on how you could be determined to be insane. Yes, Brenda?
Was she able to take the kids with her to Chandler?
She was able to take the kids with her from the reports. And I don't know, I think she probably, so to speak, left in the dark of night and just packed them up and took them. And then he printed the notice, okay, in his anger, she's left, I'm not responsible for her debt kind of notice that appeared.
Legally, he would have had that right.
Legally, he probably would have, and he probably could have pursued that, but by then he's ready to take to the stage and probably in his mind, you know, trying to convince the world that his wife was in the wrong. And I just found this case to be such a fascinating look at society, male-dominated society, and even the reasons people could go to, and if I back up to that slide, the reasons that they could be sent, and highlighted in yellow is domestic trouble. 21 men and 34 women were admitted to St. Peter because of domestic problems. Today we know divorces play out. They play out in the court of public opinion. In divorce court, they're pretty cut and dried for the judge to determine who gets which property and separate things on a very legal, factual basis, even related to children, who gets custody, visitation, all of that. It's handled in a court. In this case, your domestic problems might get you committed to and what they called an insane asylum at the time. There are lots of things. You see ill health at the top of that. Ill health, again, if your health was such that you were a danger to yourself, you could be sent there. Family members, as in the case we looked at, his wife, made that accusation. So if you're tasked with caring for somebody that has poor health, and you don't have the financial or physical means or resources to do that, you might take an elderly loved parent and have them brought up for insanity charges because then they are sent to a place like the insane asylum and they're given care that you can't provide for them. And so while it seemed cut and dried on what the reasons were you could be sent, certainly there were ways to use loopholes or work the system. Oh, my elderly parent is insane, when really they may have been an actual risk to themselves because they were a falling risk or something like that. And we also know about Alzheimer's and dementia and those types of things today. So in some cases, it might have been age-related dementia that was setting in and they would go there. And then just lots of other things. I found it absolutely hilarious that if you consulted a fortune teller, that meant you were insane. Use of tobacco, alcoholism, epilepsy, and again, the epilepsy or other diseases was really related to, as an alcoholic, you could be a danger to yourself, but you could also be a danger to the public because some people who drink in excess become violent. And so it was put them in a place where they're protecting society without really treating because they didn't understand mental health and some of the causes.
Did you say where St. Peter's is?
St. Peter was in St. Peter, Minnesota. It eventually became less of a mental health institution and more of a drug and alcohol treatment. It's kind of shifting again back to some mental health treatment, but it has gone through changes over the years, and it's not called the insane asylum anymore. We've gotten better with our verbiage for treating people with mental health issues.
Is that building still there?
Some of the buildings are there. They expanded. They've torn down old and replaced with new. I'm not sure the one in the image is still standing. I don't think it is. It was kind of a large campus at its, I hate to say heyday, but at the height of people going there, it was almost a compound of buildings. And there might have been a building where the people that suffered from alcohol were in one building and people with epilepsy in another, and so on. Did you have a question, Marge?
Didn't they even have a group there at St. Peter for children of families that couldn't keep them? Yeah. Wasn't that St. Peter or was that?
Owatonna had an orphanage, yeah.
They had.
I don't know that St. Peter took children. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Dennis?
It looked like in the picture there were 4 buildings.
Yeah.
Was there a pharmacy attached to it?
Yes, it was a multi-acre site. It did have farming, and we find that with a lot of these institutions, even like the Native American boarding schools, they were set up because they were somewhat self-sustaining in that they had like dairy cattle to provide the milk and the butter to feed the patient, and large gardens, and some of the people that were sent to St. Peter were given jobs, like something to do that they were able to handle, so they might be working in the gardens and kitchens and so on. Yes?
And one of the larger categories was religious excitement. Do you have any idea what that would be?
I have just a tiny little glimmer of what that might be. In my research for the Murder and Mayhem book that's coming out next week, in looking at insanity, I would relate it to modern day stories of like the mother that drowned her children in the bathtub claiming that God told her to do it, or that the world was a horrible place and their children would be better in heaven. And that seems to be like if they went in line with the church but took it to the extreme that God told me to do this, anything like that would be considered religious excitement and could get you sent there. I don't know if that meant just that you attended church, quote unquote, too many times a week, or if your husband felt you were too involved in your church, your women's auxiliary. There was the Women's Christians Temperance Union that was fighting for prohibition to be put into place. So if somebody didn't like those types of activities that you were involved in, they could submit your name to the probate court and you could be judged. And then it came down to that 3-person jury to determine what religious excitement.
What was the breakdown in male and female?
I think I'm going the wrong way. In this particular one, well, if you can make it out, sorry.
26.
Yeah, 21, in domestic trouble, it was 21 men and 34 women. When you look at the columns, Some of them, death of a child, no men ended up going to, this line right here. No men were sent to the insane asylum over the loss of a child, but 9 women were. And if you can imagine the grief these families must have felt, and we know childhood disease claimed a lot of lives at this time, how you handled it could get you sent there. And not everybody that went there stayed the rest of their lives. Some people were truly there and it was like their life sentence. That's where they spent the rest of their lives. Others were there for a short period of rest and relaxation and returned. There is one story in the book that comes out next week on insanity of a mother, and she was sent to St. Peter, and then she was later returned to the family home and then developed another issue. So it's interesting because they really didn't understand mental health and how to treat it. And there weren't mental health drugs to help with it or counseling services. So some people with a period of being removed from the stressful environment they're in did fine in that environment and they'd be sent back home. But when they returned to the stressful environment, things became worse for them again. Any other questions or comments? Do you have a question for me?
No wheels on the bus here.
Hey, the wheels on the bus is fun. Well, thank you all for coming.